Today we're going to have a look at a bit of chain sharpening history. To do this, we're going to use a original 070 manual, and this, which I believe was the first chain sharpening manual that Stihl put out. I believe it is from the mid to late 60s, however I can't be sure. So these don't have dates on them, they do have part numbers, but without finding the relevant thing, don't know what I can do. To point out what was used where, to give a bit of information on this, in the 070, it says, we recommend the chipper chain of 404 pitch for cutting lengths of up to 105 centimeters, 42 inches. Anything above that, that's when they switch to half inch. Before we move on to the actual chain sharpening book, I thought I'd point this out because some people might find it interesting. The break-in period for an 070. Fill the fuel tank with a gasoline and oil mixture of 20-1 for the first 50 operating hours, 25-1 thereafter. They were using SAE 30 oil. There was no two-stroke oil that they were recommending at this stage. It was just regular SAE 30 mono weight engine oil that they were mixing with the fuel. I find this interesting because I bet if you went around and pulled down a lot of the saws that are out there these days, a lot of guys aren't getting 50 hours on them, never alone switching to a different oil ratio after that point. So let's get into some of the sharpening stuff. Something that may be of interest to some people, this was their instructions for chain tension on hard nose bars. Roller noses were not an option at this stage. They come later, and then we got the modern sprocket nose bar. This stage are all hard nose, and that's how they were adjusting them. They had a little bit of drip sag at the bottom of the bar. That's still how you tension hard nose bars today. There is very detailed instructions for chain break-in. This is something that has gone away these days. We don't really talk about it. Some of the manufacturers give small recommendations. For the most part, they don't. Back then, generally they would recommend you soak the chain in oil before you use it. You apply excess oil to it. At this point in this book, I recommend running it just above the clutch engagement speed for 10 to 15 minutes as part of your break-in. Generally not done these days. Recommended oil at the time, this Mobil ALMO number 3. I'm not sure what type of oil that is. I believe it to just be a regular SAE 30 oil. I don't believe at that stage it had any tackifier in it. We get the recommendations at low temperatures to mix oil with 1 part kerosene, so a 4-to-1 ratio. You still see that currently now in some places. Generally below freezing, you start mixing kerosene to thin the oil. Over here we get more details, basically breaking down the advantage of the chipper chain. This is a great advantage of chipper chain, that it can be sharpened with a round file even out in the field. Remember, this is just after we've moved away from the scratcher chain period, well, as far as Stihl's concerned anyway. So it was in the late 40s and early 50s that we moved away from all those scratcher chains and got to the chipper chain, the Cox or Oregon, and as well as Borg-Warner Atkins were the really early front runners on them. At this stage, we still haven't gone to a semi-chisel as such at the time of this book. Well, still hadn't anyway. The first of the 3/8 semi-chisels was early 1960, so around 1964, I believe, and that was Oregon that created that to suit the Homelight XL12. So at this stage, we're still mostly dealing with chipper chains. There were full chisel chains out there, they just weren't that common. Borg-Warner had hit pretty hard in the 50s with their chamfer chisel. I believe they're still pushing on through this period. So this is where it gets sort of interesting. A lot of this information remains similar even to today. So we say here, no matter whether you file by hand or with a filing device, make it a rule to sharpen your chain frequently, but do not file too much. Frequent touch-ups are better than waiting until the chain is really dull. For ordinary filing in the field, mostly 2 or 3 filing strokes on each cutter are sufficient. Be sure to maintain correct filing angle on all cutters. If you read a Stihl manual even from today, that is the information they give. They want you to file frequently. They don't want you to absolutely stuff it up and then start removing bulk material. We all know that's not how it goes in the real world. Sometimes you hit things, shit happens. Now this is where things get sort of a little pedantic. It gets away from what would be recommended now just due to how involved this is. Before we describe the right filing practice, the correct filing angle and correct depth gauge setting, let's say a word about preparing to sharpen. So they're mentioning when you're sharpening, you always get filings or grinding dust. So what they're concerned about here is the shavings, like the metal filings, getting caught up in the chain and getting into the rivets. So it's never really spoken about these days, but it can potentially happen. It's not something I've ever bothered with really cleaning them off, but it doesn't hurt to keep it in mind. They give us warnings about obviously using actual chainsaw files. Point of interest here for people: when you coat a file with charcoal or chalk, you will get a smooth cutting edge. So if you're familiar with files and you use them in other applications, chalking them is something that's done usually on soft metals to prevent clogging. It'll stop all these little metal chips getting caught up in there. The other thing it can be used for is really fine finishing work. If you chalk them, or they're mentioning charcoal as well, it basically lubricates the surface. It takes away some of the cutting effect of the file. It leaves a much more polished thing. I really want to do something looking into if there's any benefit to this. The problem is trying to get really up close imagery of a chain. My suspicion is any benefit that would come from it would be due to the cleaner breakage of the chrome on the outside of the cutter. Obviously, when you file, it creates a burr. That burr breaks off. Theoretically speaking, the smoother the way that it is cut and the smoother the surface across a tooth, the smaller the breakage pattern would be. It's going to be jagged on the side of the tooth. It is really difficult to get very up close images of a chain to actually see if this occurs. Someone out there's probably got a microscope that can do this. I don't have the equipment to really get in there. Be very curious to try it someday. I don't think it would make too much of an effect on cutting speed, but I think it would make a big difference on edge retention. You never know though. Might make no difference at all. All right, we're going to have a look here at the angles. You'll notice something. They're mentioning 55 and 35. So I'm guessing for a period here, they were trying to go with this measurement being 90. They wanted to standardize the angles in a way that makes more sense as far as I'm concerned. However, we never did. For the most part these days, this angle here will be 0 and we sharpen. They're giving the example of 35, it's chipper chain, and that's what we do. Realistically, it's the same angle. 35, having that as 0, going to there is 35. If we call that 90, 55, we're working off the exact same angle. It's just a reference point that changes. To me, that made more sense. On the other pages, it makes reference to it that you may have seen it listed either way before. It does talk in here, the correctly filed cutter has therefore had a complementary angle of 55 to 60. So for the most part, and it does mention this, top plate angles, like your filing angle, throughout the period of having chipper chain, was discovered extremely early on that it works best between 50 and 60, or in current terms, between 30 and 40. That's the ideal range generally for everything. What changed is how common ball chisel chains were, and that's when it started reducing to sort of 25. But for most round file chipper chains and semi chisels, that 30 to 35 mark is generally accepted as being ideal. Works through just about all situations. So here it goes on a bit more about that. It's telling us do not make larger or lower angles than 60 or 50, so between 30 and 40, depending on how you want to zero it. This is where things get controversial. There's plenty of arguments these days against doing this. People will tell you all the reasons why it'll work as long as you set depth gauges to the same height as the tooth. I've explained this before. I don't really want to be involved in an argument about it. However, what they're saying here is true. By all means, set your depth gauge however you want. You're not going to avoid one of the facts of life. As the height of the cutters get lower to the rear, our top plate clearance angle, they all become lower from the front to the back. All cutters must have the same length. The reason for that is it changes the cutter's height. They want all the cutters to be at the same height. Can they be different? Yes. Do they still cut? Yes. Do they cut as well as they possibly could? Probably not. Here they're just pointing out they're wanting that same angle on everything. Again, they're using 55. The way we currently speak, that would be 35. Something that a lot of people may not know, they are calling for side plate angles of 90 degrees. They want it vertical. The same thing occurs to this day with chipper change. That is how I file it today. Semi-chisels change, so we're generally done at about approximately 85. Modern ones, Husky's calling for 60 on theirs. Oregon's gone to 70 on most of them. The Stihl RMs are 75. They still work with them damn near vertical. At this point in time, the term hook was used to describe a filing mistake. Hook was never a good thing. It changed over time. The meaning of the word changed. But yeah, kind of interesting. Here's something I disagree with them about. Still, for whatever reason, went with this 1/10 of the file above the top of the top plate for decades. Oregon dipped their toe in doing this as well for a while. Most of the manufacturers have. To my mind, it's just sort of a general guide. No one using a file can actually tell what 1/10 or what 1/20 or whatever percentage is. Most people cannot tell. I certainly can't. What I can tell you is if you follow the recommendations, you set it all up in a jig and you hold 1/10 above the top of the top plate, it creates too much top plate cutting angle and they dull really, really quick. It never worked. It never gave their recommended angles. Not on chain from then, doesn't work on chain from today. I don't know why they persisted with it, honestly. Depth gauges. Notice what they're referring to here, shaping the front of a depth gauge. You need it to slope away. I've explained this multiple times. I don't really know what else to say about it. Just get the front of it out of the way. Depth gauge settings back then were between 0.8 and 1 millimeter, so sort of 32 thou and 40 thou. Remember big saws, big chain, things were happening. That's how they ran things back then. This book does not cover 3/8 chain. There was no 325. Same depth gauge tool they currently sell. Holding the file flat. They've done that forever. They're talking about cutter lengths, keeping them equal. They keep them equal, as I said, because they become lower as they go back. So what I find interesting throughout this book is how similar it is to all the current recommendations. Even these drawings, for the most part, explaining chain damage and what's occurred to cause it. All of this is still used in their current information. So here we are sort of 70 years later, they're still using the same info. So I find that kind of interesting. I've got a few chains that show exactly this actually. I need to make a video showing you guys how a lot of this stuff occurs and what it looks like when it happens, but I have quite a few older Stihl 404 chains that are worn in this exact way. But the information given is all pretty similar. You see all your common sharpening mistakes, your back slopes, no top plate cutting angle, again a back slope, the effects that occur, you know, where it wears the chain, what happens. This just breaks down where the different wear points and what's caused it. How the lower part of your drive links wear and what's occurred there. This information is still published by most of the chain manufacturers now. It's pretty handy. There you go, that's a spur sprocket. It'll wear up through there. Cracks in the lowers. I haven't seen a lot of that lately, which is a good thing. This could be interesting for a few people. Again, this information is still widely given out by manufacturers today. Top of depth gauge, very shiny and grooved with no file marks showing. So it's polishing the very top of it. That means they're too high. Front corner of depth gauge shiny or worn. You can only see the file marks on the very top, but it's really, really shiny on the front. Extremely low depth gauge setting. It's allowing them to rock back too far. Again, drawings of making sure your depth gauges are correct. You can see these have been done incorrectly because they're leaning inwards. You see a lot where they're sloping one side or the other because people don't hold the gauge on there correctly, or when they're not using a gauge, they're doing it wrong. Again, front of it hasn't been rounded off, too much taken off. Explained this before, but about a 10-degree angle down is what you're aiming for. Most of them will have witness marks. Follow the witness mark. There we go. Like I said, the term hook was used to describe a mistake. Cutting edge hooked, too much of a shape in it. Back then, that was purely a mistake. Your back slope, missed a lot of it. Wrong angles, inconsistent angles. Pretty standard issue stuff. What else do we have? Filing, 5.5 and a 5mm. So the file sizes were slightly different. There was no 4.8s back then. They were some of the tools available at the time. The old breaker. I have one of these. They're a Grandbird manufactured bar mounting filing jig. I have a Stihl branded one of them from that era. Actually has that part number. So yeah, not a lot of great information. Nothing too exciting, but I just thought I'd share it because it shows some of the history. It's amazingly similar to the information they put out today. Some of the tools, the old HOS grinder, the USG wasn't around at this era. Again, just touching on depth gauges around it. The information's been surprisingly consistent for a very, very long time. They're just all parts for an 070. Nothing too excited. But yeah, don't know if anyone learned anything out of that, but hopefully someone found it interesting. I like collecting these old books because I do find them interesting. I have a bunch of the older McCulloch ones, some of the Oregon ones. This is the oldest of the Stihl ones. I just find it interesting to see what they were doing back then, what's changed since. Generally, most of the information has remained pretty similar. So that's it for today.